Richard Thorne believed he was ending a man's career. He stood, silhouetted against the vast plate glass window of his corner office, a figure of sharp angles and expensive fabric. Below, the city sprawled, a concrete kingdom he considered his own. Across the polished expanse of his mahogany desk, Liam sat perfectly still, his hands resting in his lap. The office, a monument to Richard's ego, was designed to intimidate. It was vast, minimalist, and cold, with a single, brutalist sculpture squatting in the corner like a loyal gargoyle. Everything was a power play with Richard, from the chair you were offered, always lower than his, to the deliberate way he made you wait. "So it's come to this, Liam," Richard said, his voice a smooth, condescending purr. He turned from the window, a smirk playing on his lips. "I'm not going to dance around it. Your position at Thorne Architects is no longer tenable." Liam didn't react. He simply watched the man who had, piece by piece, dismantled his life over the past year. He looked at the perfect suit, the gleaming watch that cost more than a family car, the self-satisfied glint in his eyes. He also saw Clara, his wife, standing near the door. She was a silent, beautiful statue, her gaze fixed on a point somewhere over Liam's shoulder, refusing to meet his eyes. Her presence was the cruelest part of the entire spectacle, a final, public ratification of his humiliation. "My position," Liam's voice was quiet, measured. It held no tremor, no anger. It was the voice of a man observing a weather pattern, not a man being professionally executed. "I was a partner, Richard. We merged our firms." Richard laughed, a short, barking sound that echoed in the sterile room. "A merger?" "Yes, that's what the papers said. It was more of an acquisition, let's be honest. I absorbed your little boutique operation, your quaint, earnest projects. It was a charity case, Liam, brokered by Clara because she felt sorry for you." Clara flinched at the mention of her name, a barely perceptible tightening of her jaw. But she remained silent, the silent enabler. That was the role she had chosen, and she played it to perfection. "The board agrees," Richard continued, gesturing vaguely as if a council of titans was arrayed behind him. In reality, Richard's board was a collection of yes-men and investors dazzled by his charisma. "Your focus is too small. Community centers, sustainable housing, it's sentimental nonsense. It doesn't have the scale, the vision. It doesn't make money. Not the kind of money we're interested in." He picked up a thick document from his desk and let it drop. It was a proposal Liam had spent months on, a landmark urban renewal project. "This, for example, tedious, unprofitable. We're in the business of building monuments to success, Liam, not shelters for the unfortunate." Liam's gaze drifted to his own briefcase, resting on the floor beside his chair. Inside was a worn, leather-bound journal. To an observer, it was a simple notebook. To Liam, it was an arsenal. He felt a strange sense of calm settle over him. Richard saw a man he was firing. Liam saw a man who was already a ghost, haunting the ruins of a company he thought he still controlled. Richard Thorne was confident in his power. What he didn't know was that every insult, every condescending remark, every stolen idea had been meticulously recorded. Within 1 year, this entire building, the company, and the very legacy Richard was so proud of would belong to the man he was so casually dismissing. The chain of events had already been set in motion. This is a story about the difference between perceived power and real strength. It's about patience, dignity, and the quiet, methodical execution of a plan born from profound betrayal. Before we continue, I want to welcome you. If you enjoy stories about vindication and seeing arrogance meet its match, you're in the right place. Go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. And I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Drop your city or country in the comments below. It's amazing to see how far these stories travel. Now, let's get back to that office where a man's world was supposedly falling apart, but was in fact just beginning to fall into place. Liam's eyes met Clara's one last time. He was searching for something, a flicker of doubt, a hint of remorse, a shadow of the woman he had married. He found nothing. Her face was a beautiful, polished mask of indifference. She had made her choice. "So that's it," Liam asked, his voice still impossibly calm. I'm out. That's it, Richard confirmed, a triumphant gleam in his eye. He was enjoying this, savoring the moment. He walked over to Clara and placed a possessive hand on her waist. It was a deliberate, final act of dominance. Security will escort you. Your personal effects will be boxed up and sent to, well, wherever it is you'll be going. Liam stood up. He was not a physically imposing man like Richard, but he possessed a stillness that was its own form of power. He adjusted his tie, picked up his briefcase, and walked toward the door. He didn't look back at the empire Richard had built, the office he had helped design, or the woman he had once loved. As he passed Clara, he spoke, his voice so low only she could hear it. I hope it's worth it. Her mask finally cracked. For a split second, a flash of fear crossed her face. Then it was gone, replaced by a hardened resolve. Liam walked out of the office, the heavy door closing behind him with a soft, definitive click. In the hallway, a security guard waited, looking apologetic. Liam just nodded. He wasn't being escorted out. He was being released. Richard, in his monumental arrogance, had just handed Liam the one thing he needed most: freedom. The war had been declared, but as Liam stepped into the elevator, a faint, knowing smile touched his lips. Richard didn't know it yet, but he had already lost. To understand the depth of the betrayal, one had to go back a year. Back to a time when Liam's world was not cold mahogany and silent judgment, but warm blueprints and the scent of fresh coffee in his own small, sunlit studio. Liam had been the sole proprietor of Hearthstone Design, a firm that was the architectural equivalent of a well-loved first edition book. It wasn't flashy, but it had substance. He specialized in creating spaces that served communities, libraries that felt like secular cathedrals, low-income housing with dignity baked into the floor plans, and public parks that encouraged human connection. His work won awards, but they were the kind of awards that came with plaques, not massive cash prizes. He was respected, admired in his niche, and deeply fulfilled. Then came Clara's ambition. She loved Liam, or so he believed, but she was also seduced by a different kind of success. She saw the world through the lens of glossy magazines and society pages. And in that world, Richard Thorne was a king. Richard had been a friend of her family's, a figure of dazzling wealth and influence who had always lingered on the periphery of their lives. His firm, Thorne Architects, built the stark, glass-and-steel monoliths that dominated the skyline. They were cold, powerful, and wildly profitable. He wants to merge, Liam, Clara had said one evening, her voice alight with an excitement he hadn't heard in years. They were in their comfortable, modest home, a home Liam had designed and built with his own hands. He's so impressed with your portfolio. He says you have the soul his company is missing. Liam had been skeptical. Richard Thorne doesn't care about soul, Clara. He cares about square footage and profit margins. Our philosophies are polar opposites. Don't be so cynical, she chided, her eyes shining. This is the opportunity of a lifetime. Imagine it, Liam. Your vision, but with his resources. You could build your community centers on a national scale. You wouldn't have to fight for every grant, every permit. Think of the good you could do. Her argument was seductive because it preyed on his own deepest desires. He didn't want to do more good, to build more. He was tired of the constant financial struggle, the fight for scraps. Perhaps she was right. Perhaps he could be the conscience of Richard's corporate machine. It was a fatal miscalculation, born of love and a willful blindness to his wife's changing priorities. The merger was structured as a partnership, but it felt like a surrender. Liam's 3 trusted employees were absorbed into Thorne's corporate labyrinth. His sunlit studio was exchanged for a sterile cubicle in a towering skyscraper. And his name was hyphenated onto Richard's, an afterthought on the corporate letterhead, Thorne Hearthstone. Within 6 months, the Hearthstone was quietly dropped during a corporate rebranding. When Liam protested, Richard had clapped him on the shoulder. It's cleaner, buddy. More muscular. Thorne Architects just sounds like money. The humiliations were small at first, like 1,000 paper cuts. Richard would refer to Liam's past projects as his hobby. He would reassign Liam's most promising junior architects to his own pet projects, leaving Liam with interns. The real turning point came during the pitch for the Viridian Tower, a luxury condominium project. The client was a notoriously difficult developer who was also an architecture enthusiast. He was unconvinced by Richard's soulless glassbox design. In a moment of desperation during the meeting, Richard had turned to Liam. Liam, here, has a more organic approach. Why don't you show them that sketch you were working on? Liam, caught off guard, presented an idea he'd been developing for a residential building that incorporated vertical gardens, passive solar design, and communal spaces, all tenets of his old firm. The developer was captivated. They won the contract on the strength of Liam's concept. At the celebration dinner that night, Richard stood and gave a toast. I want to thank my team, he'd said, raising his glass, for helping me realize my vision for the Viridian Tower. It takes a lot of work to take a complex idea from my head and put it on a paper. He'd winked at Liam. Even my boy Liam here managed to keep up. The room applauded. Liam sat there, a glass of champagne in his hand, feeling the chill of absolute betrayal. He looked at Clara, who was beaming at Richard, her face glowing with pride for the man who had just stolen her husband's work in front of 100 people. Later that night, at home, he tried to explain how he felt. He erased me, Clara. He stood up there and took credit for everything. Oh, Liam, don't be so sensitive, she'd sighed, taking off her earrings. It's a team. You're all working for the same goal. Richard is the face of the company. That's just how it works. You need to learn to play the game. That was the night he opened the leather journal. It was a gift from his late father, a master carpenter, with the inscription, "Measure twice, cut once." He opened it to the first page and wrote the date. Then he wrote down the details of the Viridian Tower pitch, Richard's speech, and Clara's dismissal. He didn't know exactly what he was doing, only that he needed to record the truth, even if only for himself. He needed a record. From that day on, he documented everything, every slight, every lie, every stolen idea, every questionable financial decision Richard made. He was no longer just an architect. He was becoming an archivist of his own destruction, measuring every cut with meticulous precision. The year that followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Richard, emboldened by his success with the Viridian Tower, a project now known entirely as Richard Thorne's masterpiece, grew more brazen. He saw Liam not as a partner, but as a court jester in his kingdom, a relic of a bygone era of feel-good architecture that had to be tolerated for Clara's sake. The office became a stage for Liam's daily humiliation. At weekly design meetings, Richard would project one of Liam's detailed, thoughtful blueprints onto the main screen. "Okay, team," he'd announce with a theatrical sigh. "Let's see what folksy wisdom Liam has for us today." He would then proceed to publicly critique it, using terms like provincial, unambitious, and his personal favorite, lacking in audacity. He encouraged the younger, more sycophantic architects to join in, turning Liam's design reviews into bloodsport. Liam would sit through it all, his face a mask of calm neutrality, his mind a steel trap, recording every word, every sneer. In his briefcase, his journal grew heavier. The social humiliations were even more cutting, orchestrated with Clara's smiling complicity. They attended a gala at the city's art museum, a major event for the city's elite. Richard, holding court with a circle of developers and city officials, spotted Liam across the room. "Gentlemen," Richard boomed, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I want you to meet my partner, Liam. He's the soul of our operation." He draped a heavy arm over Liam's shoulders. "While I'm out there wrestling multi-million-dollar deals to the ground, he's making sure our buildings have good karma." The circle of powerful men chuckled politely. It was a joke, but the message was clear. Liam was the designated soft-hearted fool. Liam looked past them and saw Clara, laughing along, her hand resting on the arm of a city councilman Richard was trying to impress. She met Liam's gaze for a second, her smile faltering before she turned away, absorbed back into the glittering crowd. In that moment, Liam understood. She wasn't just enabling Richard. She was an active participant. She was trading her husband's dignity for a seat at the table. While Richard was busy building his public legend, Liam was quietly building his escape route. He had full access to the company's financials as a partner, a detail Richard, in his arrogance, had overlooked. He treated the company's server like a private library. Late at night, long after everyone had gone home, Liam would sit in his silent office, the city lights twinkling below, and he would study. He traced the flow of money, the bloated expense accounts, the risky loans, and the dangerously thin profit margins on Richard's audacious projects. Richard was a gambler, leveraging the company's assets to the hilt to fund his monumental ego. He was building a house of cards on a foundation of debt. Liam saw the pattern, the inevitable trajectory of it all. It was a simple matter of physics. Every overextended object has a breaking point. He began making quiet moves. He sold the home he had built, the last tangible piece of his old life, and moved into a small, anonymous apartment. He told Clara it was to downsize and simplify, a phrase she accepted without question, too preoccupied with plans to redecorate the penthouse apartment Richard was leasing for them. The proceeds from the sale, along with his own substantial savings from his Hearthstone days, did not go into a new home. They went to a man named Arthur Harrison. Mr. Harrison was the opposite of Richard Thorne. He was an old money investor, a titan of industry who operated from the shadows. He wore simple, well-made suits and spoke in quiet, definitive sentences. He had been a silent admirer of Liam's work for years, a patron of one of the community libraries Liam had designed. Liam had reached out to him, not with a plea for help, but with a business proposition. They met in a discreet private club that smelled of old leather and wisdom. Liam laid out his analysis of Thorne Architects. He didn't speak of his personal humiliation, only of the numbers. He showed Mr. Harrison the company's structural weaknesses, the over-leveraged assets, and the coming storm. Richard Thorne is flying too close to the sun, Liam said, his voice even. When his wings melt, the company will be in free fall. The banks that hold his debt will panic. They will sell it off for pennies on the dollar to mitigate their losses. Mr. Harrison listened, his steepled fingers resting on his chin. He was a legendary figure, known for his ability to see value where others saw ruin. "And you want me to help you be the one to catch it," Harrison stated, not a question. "I want you to be my partner," Liam corrected gently. "We will form a holding company, a blind entity. When the time is right, we will buy that debt. We will become the primary creditor. We will acquire the assets, shed the liabilities, namely Richard Thorne, and rebuild the company based on a sustainable, profitable model." A slow smile spread across Mr. Harrison's face. He was not a man who enjoyed drama, but he was a man who despised hubris, and he loved a well-structured plan. "Measure twice, cut once," Harrison murmured, quoting the inscription on a library plaque he had once read. "Exactly," Liam replied. And in the quiet, wood-paneled room, the first nail was hammered into Richard Thorne's corporate coffin. The final months leading up to Liam's dismissal were a study in contrasts. Outwardly, Richard Thorne's star had never been brighter. He was the cover story of Architecture Today, hailed as a visionary. He had just secured the Olympus project, a breathtakingly ambitious and colossally expensive mixed-use skyscraper that promised to redefine the city's skyline. It was the apotheosis of his entire philosophy, bigger, shinier, and more audacious than anything that had come before. The company threw a lavish party to celebrate, a decadent affair with champagne fountains and a string quartet. Richard was radiant, a sun king in his court, accepting congratulations. Clara was at his side, a perfect queen. She wore a backless, emerald green dress that shimmered under the lights, a gift from Richard. She looked happier than Liam had ever seen her. Throughout the night, she and Richard were inseparable, their body language speaking a language of intimacy that transcended friendship. They would laugh at a shared joke, his hand lingering on the small of her back. They were a power couple, and Liam was a spectator at their coronation. He spent most of the party near the balcony, nursing a single glass of club soda, watching the city lights. He felt no anger, no jealousy. Those emotions had been burned out of him long ago, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. He was an engineer observing a structure under stress, waiting for the inevitable fracture. He saw Richard's success not as a victory, but as a final, fatal overextension. The Olympus project was a gamble so huge that it would either make him a legend or bankrupt him utterly. Liam, having studied the financials, knew which one it would be. While Richard and Clara danced, Liam was living a parallel life. His small, Spartan apartment had become a command center. The walls were covered in financial charts, timelines, and legal frameworks. The worn leather journal sat in the center of his desk, its pages now filled with the intricate details of his plan. He and Mr. Harrison had formed their holding company. Phoenix Holdings. It was an anonymous entity, registered offshore, untraceable to either of them. Through it, they had already begun making discreet inquiries with the banks that were financing Richard's ever-growing mountain of debt. They were positioning themselves, waiting. The emotional distance at home had become a chasm. Liam and Clara were roommates sharing a zip code. Their conversations were purely logistical. "I'll be late tonight. Richard is taking me to the symphony. The cleaner comes on Tuesday. Could you leave out the payment?" One evening, about a week before the firing, Liam was in his small home office, the glow of his monitor illuminating stacks of blueprints. But these weren't for Thorn Architects. They were his own designs, projects he was developing for the company he would one day lead. They were innovative, sustainable, and deeply human-centered. He was lost in his work, feeling a flicker of the old passion, the pure joy of creation, when Clara entered. She didn't knock. She stood in the doorway, wrapped in a silk robe, a look of annoyance on her face. "Liam, what is all this?" she asked, gesturing at his papers. "Work," he answered simply, not looking up. "It's such a mess. We're having people over on Saturday. Richard's celebrating the final Olympus funding. I need this room for the caterers to set up a bar. Can you please clear all this clutter out?" Clutter. She had called his life's work, his passion, his future clutter. He finally looked up at her, and for the first time, he felt a pang of something akin to pity. She had no idea what was real anymore. She was living in a shimmering, hollow illusion, and she had mistaken it for the world. "Of course," he said, his voice soft. "I'll clear it out." She smiled, relieved. "Thank you. Oh, and Liam, try to look happy on Saturday. It's a big night for Richard. For us. For us." The word hung in the air between them, a lie so profound it was almost comical. He watched her walk away, her silk robe whispering down the hallway. He looked back at his desk, at the plans for a future she couldn't see. He reached out and placed his hand on his leather journal. The quiet before the storm. The final measurements had been taken. The time to cut was fast approaching. He knew the firing was coming. In a way, he was counting on it. It was the last piece of the puzzle, the public, final act of hubris that would justify everything that was to come. 1 year, 365 days of patience, precision, and quiet, relentless work. The anniversary of his firing was not a day Liam marked with any ceremony. For him, it was simply go day. The emergency board meeting at Thorn Architects was scheduled for 2 p.m. Liam knew this because, as the primary, albeit anonymous, holder of their debt, he was the one who had effectively called the meeting. The Olympus project, Richard's monument to himself, had collapsed. The funding, built on a pyramid of high-interest loans and unrealistic projections, had evaporated as key investors pulled out. Contractors were walking off the job site. The company was hemorrhaging money, and the banks, smelling blood, had called in their loans they had already sold to Phoenix Holdings. Richard Thorn was trapped. He just didn't know the nature of the trap or who had built it. Liam spent the morning in a way that would have seemed utterly mundane to an outsider. He had a light breakfast. He read the financial news. He went for a long walk in the park, a park he himself had designed years ago, watching children play and couples stroll. He felt a profound sense of calm. There was no vengeful glee, no giddy anticipation. There was only the quiet satisfaction of a complex plan perfectly executed. He was an architect, and this was his greatest design. At 1:30 p.m., he met Arthur Harrison in the lobby of a skyscraper across the street from the Thorn Architects building. Mr. Harrison was, as always, impeccably dressed and preternaturally calm. He held out a hand. "Ready, Liam?" "I am," Liam said, his handshake firm. They didn't speak as they crossed the street. They walked into the gleaming, opulent lobby of the building where Liam had been so publicly humiliated. The receptionist, a young woman who had always treated him with a kind of pitying sympathy, looked up. Her eyes widened in recognition, then confusion. "Liam? Can I help you?" "We're here for the 2 p.m. board meeting," Liam said, his voice pleasant. Liam Sterling and Arthur Harrison. The name, Arthur Harrison, landed with the force of a physical blow. The receptionist fumbled with her phone, her professional composure dissolving. Arthur Harrison was a myth, a legend. People like him didn't just walk into an office. Of course, Mr. Harrison." Right away, they were buzzed through without another word. As they rode the silent, high-speed elevator up to the 50th floor, Liam looked at his reflection in the polished brass. He saw a man he recognized again. The year had stripped away the doubt and the hurt, leaving behind a core of quiet confidence. They stepped out into the familiar hushed corridor leading to the main conference room. Through the frosted glass walls, Liam could see the silhouettes of the board members. He could feel the panic radiating from the room. He took a deep breath, adjusted his tie, and pushed open the heavy glass door. The conversation inside stopped instantly. Every head turned. Richard was at the head of the table, his face pale, his usual swagger replaced by a desperate, brittle energy. He was in the middle of trying to sell the board on a catastrophic plan. "And if we sell the portfolio to Omnicorp, yes, we take a massive hit, but we survive. We live to fight another day." His voice trailed off as he saw Liam. For a moment, his face was a canvas of pure, uncomprehending shock. Then, it hardened into a sneer. "Liam, what in God's name are you doing here? This is a private board meeting. Security. They know we're here." "Richard," Liam said calmly, walking further into the room. Mr. Harrison followed, a silent, imposing presence that immediately shifted the room's center of gravity. The board members, men who idolized Harrison, stared at him as if they were seeing an apparition. "And who is this?" Richard demanded, though a flicker of recognition and fear was dawning in his eyes. "Richard Thorne, meet Arthur Harrison," Liam said. "He's my business partner." The name, spoken aloud in this context, sucked the remaining air out of the room. Richard's face went from pale to ashen. He looked from Liam to Harrison and back again, the gears of his mind grinding, unable to process the impossible reality before him. "I don't understand," one of the board members stammered, looking at Harrison. "What is your interest in this, sir?" Mr. Harrison did not speak. He simply nodded toward Liam. It was Liam's stage. Liam walked to the empty chair at the opposite end of the table from Richard and remained standing. He placed his old leather journal on the polished surface, the symbolic object, the repository of his journey. "I'll be happy to clarify," Liam began, his voice resonating with a quiet authority that commanded attention. "As you know, the company is on the verge of insolvency. The loans for the Olympus project, and indeed most of the company's operational debt, have been called." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "What you don't know," he continued, his gaze sweeping across the stunned faces of the board, "is that over the past year, my holding company, Phoenix Holdings, has been methodically and legally acquiring that debt from the primary lenders." He let that statement hang in the air, a quiet bomb, the devastating revelation that changed everything. A nervous tremor went through Richard. "Your holding company? What are you talking about? You don't have that kind of money." Liam smiled, a thin, humorless smile. "You were so certain of that, weren't you, Richard? You saw me as a man who designed sentimental nonsense. You never bothered to look deeper. You never considered that my quaint, earnest projects were the foundation of a highly successful, specialized consultancy that I never fully dissolved. You never imagined that the sale of the house I built with my own hands would become the seed capital for a new venture, a venture that attracted partners like Mr. Harrison, who, unlike you, understands that true value isn't always measured in glass and steel." He turned his attention back to the board. "Phoenix Holdings is now the sole creditor for Thorne Architects, which means, gentlemen, that for all intents and purposes," he looked directly at Richard, the finality of his words like a judge's gavel, "I own this company. The silence that followed Liam's declaration was absolute. It was a dense, heavy silence, filled with the shattering of paradigms and the collapse of a world. Richard Thorne stared at Liam, his mouth slightly agape, his face a mask of disbelief rapidly crumbling into horror. The arrogant, untouchable king was naked in his own throne room, and the man he had cast out as a jester was now holding the crown. "This is insane," Richard finally croaked, his voice a dry rasp. He looked around at the board members, seeking an ally, a friendly face. He found none. Their eyes, which once held admiration for him, were now fixed on Liam with a mixture of awe, fear, and dawning respect. They were businessmen. They understood power, and the power in the room had just shifted with the force of a tectonic plate. "It's not insane, Richard," Liam said, his voice still maddeningly calm. "It's business. It's a leveraged buyout. A strategy I'm sure you've read about. Perhaps you've even used it yourself on smaller, weaker firms. The parallel was deliberate, a sharp, elegant blade of poetic justice." Liam opened his journal. He didn't need to read from it. Every word was seared into his memory, but the gesture was symbolic. It was the book of Richard's sins, and it was time for a reading. "You see, you made a critical mistake, Richard. You underestimated me. You thought I was a sentimental fool, but you never considered that a man who pays attention to the small details, the quality of light in a room, the flow of foot traffic in a park, might also pay attention to the details in a balance sheet." He began to walk slowly along the side of the long conference table, his footsteps the only sound. "Let's review the last year, shall we? I find it helpful to be specific." His voice took on the cadence of a prosecutor delivering a closing argument. "On June 14th of last year, at the Viridian Tower celebration dinner, you stood before 100 people and took sole credit for a design concept that you had mocked in private just weeks before. You call me your boy Liam, who managed to keep up. I remember the exact words." Richard flinched as if struck. "On September 22nd, Liam continued, his voice never rising. During the quarterly design review, you called my proposal for the waterfront renewal project provincial and suggested I stick to designing gazebos. You encouraged junior staff to ridicule the structural analysis. That project, by the way, has since been awarded to a rival firm and is projected to revitalize the entire district." He paused by a board member who had been particularly sycophantic. The man refused to meet his eyes, staring intently at his now meaningless notepad. "On December 5th, at the museum gala, you introduced me to the mayor as the man who makes sure your buildings have good karma, a public dismissal, couched as a joke. Everyone laughed, especially Clara. The mention of her name was a calculated cruelty, the only moment Liam allowed a hint of personal sting to enter his voice. Richard's head snapped up. "Leave her out of this," he snarled. "I would love to," Liam replied coolly, "but she was your most enthusiastic co-conspirator. She held my coat while you gutted me. She applauded you. She chose the glitter over the gold, Richard. And now the glitter is gone." He arrived back at his place at the head of the table, opposite Richard. He closed the journal. "And then there was the Olympus project, your grand folly, your monument to ego. You leveraged every asset. You cut corners on due diligence. You bullied your way into a deal the company could not sustain. You were so blinded by the reflection of your own brilliance that you failed to see the cracks in the mirror. I saw them, and I bought them." He looked at the board members. "Thorne Architects, as it exists today, is finished. It is insolvent, and as the primary creditor, Phoenix Holdings will be petitioning for a full restructuring. The name will be dissolved. The company will be rebuilt from the ground up on a foundation of integrity, sustainability, and genuine innovation. The kind of work Richard called sentimental nonsense." He finally looked back at Richard, who now seemed smaller, shrunken in his expensive suit. "You're out, Richard. Your position is no longer tenable." He used Richard's own words, the final, perfect inversion of his initial humiliation. "A severance package has been prepared. It's equivalent to the statutory minimum, plus 1 week's pay. A gesture of goodwill. Your personal effects will be boxed up and sent to you. Security will escort you out." The symmetry was devastating. The moral mirror was flawless. Richard stared, his mind finally catching up to the cataclysm. The arrogance, the confidence, all of it had been stripped away, leaving only a raw, desperate panic. "You can't do this," he whispered. Liam's expression softened, but not with pity. It was the look of a doctor informing a patient of a terminal diagnosis. "I'm not doing anything to you, Richard," he said, his voice quiet again. "This is all your own work. You built this. I just bought it." He turned to Mr. Harrison. "Arthur, I believe you have the documents for the board to review." Mr. Harrison, who had been a silent, powerful witness, stepped forward and placed a thick, leather-bound portfolio on the table. It landed with a soft, definitive thud, the sound of a world ending and a new one beginning. The aftermath was chaos distilled. As Mr. Harrison calmly began distributing the legal documents that formalized Liam's takeover, Richard Thorne finally broke. His carefully constructed facade of a master of the universe shattered into a million pieces, revealing the panicked, insecure man underneath. You can't just take my company," he stammered, his voice rising in pitch. He stood up, knocking his chair over. The sound echoed the crash of his own life. "I built this. For nothing. My name is on the door." "Not for long," Liam said, his tone devoid of emotion. He was already moving on, looking at the documents, his mind focused on the future. For him, the confrontation was over. This was just paperwork. Richard's desperation turned ugly. He lunged across the corner of the table, his face contorted in a mask of rage. "You snake! You were planning this all along, while you were eating my food, living in my world." Before he could get any closer, two of the board members, men who just an hour ago would have fetched Richard's coffee, instinctively moved to restrain him. They put their hands on his arms, their faces grim. The physical manifestation of his loss of power was stark and brutal. "Richard, calm down," one of them said, his voice firm. "It's over." Richard shook them off, but the fight had gone out of him. He stood there, panting, his expensive suit suddenly looking ill-fitting and pathetic. He looked at Liam, his eyes pleading now. The anger was gone, replaced by a terrifying, dawning comprehension of his ruin. "Liam, please," he whispered. The word was alien in his mouth. "Think about Clara. What will this do to her?" It was his last, pathetic gambit, using the woman he had stolen as a shield. Liam looked up from his papers, his gaze cold as ice. "You should have thought about that before you made her an accomplice to my public execution. You wanted her. You wanted my company. Now, you have neither. My responsibility to Clara's happiness ended the moment she chose to stand by your side and watch you fire me. My dealings with her from now on will be handled by my lawyers." The finality of it broke Richard. He sank into a nearby chair, burying his face in his hands. A low, guttural sound of despair escaped his lips. The board members looked away, embarrassed. Mr. Harrison continued his work, unfazed. The meeting concluded swiftly after that. The board, seeing the undeniable legal and financial reality, capitulated completely. They were now answerable to Phoenix Holdings. They were answerable to Liam. He gave them their first set of instructions: secure all financial records, freeze Richard's corporate accounts, and begin the process of a full audit. His commands were crisp, clear, and confident. He was a man in his element. As the board members filed out, some offering tentative, hopeful congratulations to their new leader, Liam packed his journal back into his briefcase. He and Mr. Harrison were the last to leave, apart from the broken figure of Richard Thorne still slumped in his chair. As Liam passed him, Richard looked up, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a venomous hatred. "You'll regret this," he hissed. "You think you're a hero? You're just like me. You wanted power, and you took it." Liam paused, and for the first time, he addressed Richard not as a victor to the vanquished, but as a man offering a final, bitter lesson. "You're wrong, Richard. There's a difference. You took power to feed your ego. I took it back to restore my dignity. You build monuments to yourself. I build communities. You see people as assets to be used. I see them as partners to be respected. You think this was about revenge." Liam shook his head slowly. "Revenge is a passion. This was a blueprint. and you were just a structural flaw that needed to be removed. Without another word, Liam turned and walked out of the room, leaving Richard alone in the ruins of the empire he had built and the man he had destroyed had just inherited. He didn't go straight home. He went to a bar. Not a fancy one, but a quiet neighborhood place with dark wood and low lighting. He ordered a single malt scotch and sat in a booth, watching the evening news play silently on the television above the bar. He felt nothing. Not triumph, not joy, not even satisfaction. He felt a great, yawning emptiness. The project was complete. The structure was built. Now he had to live in it. His phone buzzed. It was Clara. He ignored it. It buzzed again and again. Finally, he answered, putting it on speaker, his voice flat. "Hello, Clara." "Liam? Liam, oh my God. What did you do?" Her voice was shrill, panicked. Richard had clearly called her. "Richard is a mess. He said you took everything. How could you be so cruel, so vindictive?" There it was. The accusation he had been expecting. She didn't ask if it was true. She didn't ask why. She went straight to defending the architect of their destruction and condemning the man she had wronged. "Is that what he told you?" Liam asked, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "He said you ruined him. For what? For firing you?" "It was just a job, Liam. This is insane. This isn't you." "You're right," Liam said, and a genuine, weary sadness crept into his voice. "The man I was wouldn't have done this. The man I was would have let you both walk all over him, would have accepted the humiliation, would have faded away quietly. But you and Richard killed that man. You're talking to his replacement." There was a sob on the other end of the line. "What are we going to do? The penthouse, the cars, it's all tied to the company, Liam." The raw, naked fear in her voice was not for her husband, or for Richard, but for her lifestyle. It was the final, ugly truth laid bare. "That sounds like a problem for you and Richard to solve," Liam said, his voice hardening again. "My lawyers will be in touch regarding our divorce proceedings. I will be fair, Clara. I'm not a monster, but I am no longer your husband, and I am certainly not your safety net." He hung up the phone before she could reply. He finished his scotch, the burn in his throat a grounding sensation. The emptiness was beginning to recede, replaced by a quiet resolve. The demolition was complete. Now it was time to build. The months that followed the takeover were a whirlwind of controlled demolition and careful reconstruction. The name Thorn Architects, now synonymous with hubris and collapse, was scrubbed from existence. In its place, Liam unveiled the company he had been designing in secret. Phoenix Architecture, the name was chosen by Mr. Harrison, who had a flair for the symbolic. The new logo was a stylized bird rising from what looked like a blueprint. Liam's first order of business was to call an all-hands meeting with the remaining staff. The atmosphere in the main auditorium was thick with fear and uncertainty. They had just watched their celebrity CEO be publicly dethroned, and they expected a purge. Liam walked onto the stage, not in an expensive suit, but in the simple, comfortable clothes he'd always preferred. He looked out at the sea of anxious faces. "Good morning," he began, his voice calm and steady. "Most of you know me. For the past year, I've been the quiet guy in the corner. Today, I'm the man in charge. I know you're all worried about your jobs, so let me be clear. If you are here because you love to design, because you believe architecture can make people's lives better, and because you're willing to work with integrity, you have a home at Phoenix Architecture. If you're here because you enjoyed the champagne parties and believed bullying your colleagues was a step on the corporate ladder, I suggest you update your resume." A nervous laugh rippled through the crowd. "The era of ego-driven monuments is over," he continued. "We are no longer in the business of building shiny, empty boxes for the 1%. We're going to build for the 99%. We will build sustainably. We will build with community in mind. We will build things that last, that have meaning. It will be hard work. It won't always be glamorous, but it will be work we can be proud of. The choice is yours." It was a declaration of principle, and it worked. The sycophants and the deadwood, those who had thrived under Richard's toxic regime, quietly resigned over the next few weeks. Those who remained were the talented, the passionate, the ones who had been marginalized and overlooked, the very people Liam had always championed. He rehired the 3 trusted employees he had lost in the merger, placing them in positions of leadership. The office culture began to change, from a cutthroat arena to a collaborative studio. The soul was coming back. The consequences for Richard and Clara, meanwhile, played out like a slow, inevitable tragedy. Richard's name was toxic. His reputation, built on a foundation of charisma and lies, evaporated overnight. He tried to find work, but the world of architecture is small. No one would touch him. The story of his spectacular fall, with the delicious irony of Liam's takeover, had become a legend in the industry. He was forced to sell his expensive sports car and other trappings of his former life. He was last seen trying to launch a one-man consultancy from a small, rented office, but no clients came. The man who built skyscrapers was reduced to a caricature of failure. Clara's fall was quieter, but in many ways, more profound. The divorce settlement Liam provided was, as promised, fair. It was not punitive, but it was not a golden parachute either. It was enough for her to live a comfortable middle-class life, but the world of galas, designer gowns, and penthouse views was gone forever. She moved into a small, tasteful apartment in a respectable but unfashionable neighborhood. Her high-society friends, who had been Richard's friends first, dropped her instantly. Her invitations dried up. The phone stopped ringing. She was adrift. For years, her identity had been tied to the men in her life. First, as the respectable wife of the earnest architect, then as the glamorous partner of the corporate titan. Without a powerful man to reflect her status, she had to confront the terrifying question of who she actually was. She tried to cling to her anger at Liam, to paint him as the villain, the cruel mastermind who had destroyed her life. But in the long, quiet evenings in her new apartment, the truth was a persistent, unwelcome guest. She would remember Liam in his old studio, his face alive with passion as he described a new library design. She would remember his patience, his kindness, the way he would listen. And she would contrast it with Richard's casual cruelty, his vanity, his possessiveness. She had chosen the mirage over the oasis, and now she was dying of thirst in a desert of her own making. The choice had been hers. The consequences were hers to bear. Liam hadn't ruined her. He had simply held up a mirror, and she had finally been forced to look. 6 months later, Phoenix architecture was not just surviving, it was thriving. The industry, initially skeptical, was now taking notice. Liam's focus on sustainable, human-centric design, once dismissed as a niche, was now being hailed as visionary. The firm won a major contract to redesign a large portion of the city's public housing, a project Richard would have sneered at, but one that cemented the firm's new reputation. Liam was working harder than ever, but it was a joyful, fulfilling labor. The emptiness he had felt after the takeover had been filled, not with vengeance, but with purpose. The resolution of his personal life was quieter. He and Clara finalized their divorce amicably through lawyers. He never saw her in person. He heard through a mutual acquaintance that she had taken a job as an administrative assistant at a nonprofit. It was a humbling step down, but it was a step. He felt a distant, detached sense of hope for her. The hope one feels for a stranger who has lost their way. The love, the anger, the betrayal. It had all faded into a scar, a reminder of a past that no longer had power over him. One crisp autumn afternoon, Liam stood on a construction site. It was the groundbreaking ceremony for a new community center in an underserved neighborhood. It was a project he had designed years ago, one Richard had shelved and ridiculed. Liam had personally resurrected it as Phoenix Architecture's flagship project. The mayor was there, along with community leaders and a crowd of local residents. As Liam stood at the podium, ready to speak, he looked out at the hopeful faces in the crowd. He saw children, parents, and grandparents who would use this space. This was real. This had meaning. He spoke, not about balance sheets or profit margins, but about light, space, and dignity. He spoke about creating places where people could connect, learn, and grow. His voice was filled with a genuine passion that was more compelling than any of Richard's charismatic bluster. After the speeches, as Liam was shaking hands and talking to residents, a familiar figure appeared at the edge of the crowd. It was Arthur Harrison, his unexpected ally, his silent partner. He wasn't there in any official capacity. He had simply come to watch. "Quite a turnout," Harrison said, a rare smile on his face. "It's a good day," Liam agreed. "I read an article about Richard Thorne this morning," Harrison said, his tone casual. "He's declared bankruptcy. Personal and professional." Liam nodded, his expression unreadable. He felt a flicker of something, but it wasn't triumph. It was a kind of weary finality. The last piece of the old structure had finally crumbled to dust. "He built a weak foundation," Liam said simply. "And Clara?" Harrison asked, his voice softer. "I hear she's working, starting over." Harrison looked at Liam, his gaze sharp and perceptive. "You could have destroyed them both, you know. Financially, you could have left them with nothing. Why didn't you?" Liam thought for a moment, watching a group of children chase a balloon. "Because that's what Richard would have done," he said. "This was never about becoming him. It was about proving that his way of doing things, his way of treating people, was wrong. If I had crushed them completely, I would have become the monster I was fighting. This was about justice, not annihilation." Harrison nodded slowly, a look of profound respect in his eyes. "Measure twice, cut once," he said. "Your father was a wise man." "He was a good man," Liam corrected gently. "There's a difference." They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching the community celebrate the promise of a new beginning. Liam felt a sense of peace settle over him, deep and quiet and strong. He hadn't just bought a company. He had bought back his life. He had bought back his name. And he had done it not by sinking to his enemy's level, but by rising above it. The phoenix had truly taken flight. Later that day, Liam saw a small news item online. It was a photo from the groundbreaking ceremony. In the background, barely visible behind a tree, was a woman watching from a distance. She was dressed simply. Her hair was different. It took him a moment to recognize her. It was Clara. She wasn't there to make a scene or to ask for anything. She was just watching, observing the life she had given up, the man she had underestimated. There was a look on her face he couldn't quite decipher. Not anger, not sadness, but a kind of quiet, painful understanding. Acknowledgement. He clicked the window closed. Her story was no longer his to write. In the end, a year after the Quiet War had ended, Liam sat in his new office. It was nothing like Richard's intimidating corner suite. It was on a lower floor, closer to his team. The walls were covered in blueprints and sketches. The furniture was comfortable and functional. And one entire wall was a window overlooking the community park he had designed so long ago. The afternoon sun streamed in, illuminating the specks of dust dancing in the air. On his desk, next to a stack of project files and a cup of cooling coffee, sat the worn leather journal. He picked it up, its familiar weight a comfort in his hand. He hadn't written in it since the day of the takeover. Its purpose had been served. It was no longer an arsenal, but a historical document, a testament to a journey. He flipped through the pages, the neat, precise script a map of his own pain and perseverance. The list of grievances, the financial analyses, the strategic plans. It was all there. A blueprint for deconstruction and rebirth. He thought of Richard, a ghost haunting the fringes of the industry, a cautionary tale whispered at cocktail parties. He thought of Clara, quietly rebuilding a life from the ground up, forced to find her own value without the validation of a powerful man. He felt no pleasure in their downfall, no lingering bitterness. Their fates were not a victory, but a consequence, as natural and inevitable as gravity. They had made their choices, and the world had simply responded in kind. His own victory felt less like a triumph and more like a return to self. He had not become a king on a throne, but a master craftsman back in his workshop. The power he wielded now was not the power to dominate, but the power to create. He was building things that mattered, leading a team he respected, and living a life that was authentic to its core. He had lost a wife, a home, and a career, but in doing so, he had found his integrity, his purpose, and his own unshakable strength. The narrator's voice, which had guided us through this journey, now takes a moment to reflect. This story, in its essence, is a moral fable for our times. It reminds us that true worth is not measured by the height of our buildings, but by the strength of our foundations. It teaches us that arrogance is a brittle shield and that dignity is a quiet, unbreakable sword. Liam's story is a testament to the idea that patience is a strategic weapon and that the most profound victories are not won in loud, explosive battles, but in the silent, methodical execution of a well-laid plan. He didn't seek revenge. He sought equilibrium. He didn't destroy his enemies. He simply allowed their own actions to bring about their inevitable end. What do you think? Was Liam's response justified? Or was it a cold, calculated act of revenge? Have you ever been in a situation where you were deeply underestimated, only to prove everyone wrong? Share your thoughts and your own stories in the comments below. I read every one, and I believe our shared experiences are a powerful source of strength and connection. If this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel for more content that explores the complexities of human nature and the quiet triumph of the underestimated. Every subscription helps us continue to create these narratives. Liam closed the journal and placed it on the shelf behind his desk, among the architectural models and design awards. It was a part of his history, but it was not his future. His future was out there, in the city that spread before him. It was in the blueprints on his desk, in the hopeful faces of his team, and in the quiet, unshakable knowledge that he had faced the worst of himself and others, and had emerged not broken, but whole. He had measured twice, he had cut once, and he had built something beautiful and strong from the ruins. And for an architect like Liam, there was no greater success than that.